So in this video, we're going to be talking about the first model, which is called the circular flow diagram. In the previous video, we'll talk a little bit about the economic models and how economists use them, where we said that what we're really trying to do is trying to explain economic concepts or economic phenomena or economic issues using a very simplified version of reality. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. The goal of this type of a model is to explain in general terms how the economy is organized and how its participants interact with each other. Okay, so if you think about the economy that we live in, which consists of millions of people who engage in so many different activities every day, whether it be buying something, selling goods and services, working, hiring, so on and so forth. So to understand how the economy works, we must find some kind of a simplified way to our thinking, and understand how people are interacting with each other, how everything is being organized. So the circular flow diagram is a very visual representation of the economy. So it is visual. It's a visual model. And in this model, the economy is simplified to have some assumptions. So let's talk about the assumptions here. The first assumption that we make is that the economy only has two types of decision makers. Okay, in practice, obviously, you have many more, but two types of decision makers. The first one being firms. These are companies. And the second one being households, like us. Okay. So the goal of the firms, or what do firms do? The firms are basically producing goods and services, or produce and sell, but anyway, produce goods and services. G and S represent goods and services here. And how do they do that? They're able to do that because they are actually buying or hiring. They buy or hire factors of production. Okay, factors of production are things like land, labor, capital, etc., entrepreneurship, etc. So these are all factors of production that firms will hire to produce goods and services. Okay, and on the other hand, we have another decision maker, which are the households, like ourselves, who are responsible for buying or consuming these goods and services. Okay, and these are also the people, households also consist of people who own the factors of production. Again, factors of production are things that we require in production. So households like ourselves can own land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, etc. Okay, so these are really the two types of decision makers. So this is one assumption. And then the second assumption is that these two players, the firms and households, interact in two types of markets. Okay, so they're interacting in two markets. The first market is, now you can guess based on what they're doing. One market would be the market for factors of production. Okay, so you can say market for factors of production, and the other market would be the market for goods and services. Okay, so now once we know all of this, we can get to the visual representation of what the circular flow diagram looks like. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna put the markets in these two orange ellipses. So we're gonna put the markets for goods and services right here, and the market or markets for factors of production. Again, these are things like land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, right here. Okay, and then we're gonna list the two players in these blue boxes. Okay, so what are our two players? The first one are the firms, and the second one are households. Okay, so remember, the firms are producing and selling goods and services, and they're hiring and using the factors of production, whereas households are buying and consuming goods and services and owning and selling factors of production. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to draw two different keys for the flow of inputs and outputs versus the flow of dollars. Okay, so I'm going to make the key right here. If you see a red line, that's going to be for the flow of inputs. And outputs, and the green line that you would see in the diagram is going to represent the flow of dollars. Okay, so let's try to understand what's going on here. So let's think about what happens when you take a few dollars and you go and buy a cup of coffee from Starbucks. Okay, so if you go as a household, let's make this in green, right? You're going to the market for goods and services to buy a cup of coffee, right? And so you're spending a few dollars to get that coffee, right? And so what should flow back to you is that cup of coffee. Okay, so I'm gonna in general just put goods and services bought. Okay, now what does Starbucks do with that, with those few dollars? Okay, that is going to act as revenue, right? So revenue for the firm, which is Starbucks, that's revenue. Again, this is in green because this is representing the flow of dollars. And what's going to happen is this is sort of the two sides of the same coin here, where goods and services were sold in exchange for this revenue in this market. Okay, in this market, goods and services were sold. Now, since firms are the ones that are supposed to use factors of production to produce this coffee, firms also have to make payments to the workers in terms of wages, and maybe they're renting out a space for their coffee shop, so they have to pay rent on the land, and any profits would flow back into the market for factors of production, which are, remember, owned by households. So the profits are going to flow back in exchange for this. Okay. And so this is, there are no free lunches. So if there's a green arrow going into the markets for factors of production, what should be flowing back right here? These should be factors of production. Okay, this is like land, labor. No, land is not flowing anywhere, but this is really just, like an exchange that's happening. And capital, which is like any machines that you're employing as a firm, etc. Okay, so now wages, rent, and profits have come back into this market. Okay, and what's going on in this market for factors of production? In this market, firms and households are interacting again. Okay, households are actually selling their factors of production, so they are the ones that are actually supplying the land, labor, capital. Okay, so they're selling this in this market, and this is buying going on here. Okay, and so what should flow back then to the households? The households should be receiving income in exchange for these factors of production. Okay, so here is a simplified diagram that tells us, or like a schematic representation that tells us how the economy is organized. Decisions are made by households and firms, right? Households and firms that are the two players in this type of marketplace, where there's two markets, one for goods and services and one for factors of production. And remember that the arrows, the outer set of arrows, or the green arrows, are representing the flow of dollars or the flow of funds or money, and the inner set of arrows, which are the red arrows, are corresponding to the flow of inputs and outputs. Okay. Now you can actually say, well, we can criticize this diagram because this is really a very simplified version of reality. We in practice have a lot more going on. So one question to ask would be, well, what are we skipping? What are we excluding from this diagram? Okay, so obviously we know that we are not talking about the role of the government here. Okay, so in practice you can think about income being taxed, and then the government using those tax dollars to getting public goods or paying for education, national defense, or healthcare. And we're also excluding the international economy, so we are not talking about international trade at all here, where Starbucks could be paying taxes and also buying coffee beans from a farmer in Colombia. Okay, so that's what's omitted. And then finally, the financial sector, where you can think about Starbucks or even households trying to invest some of their money and grow some of their money. Okay, but just remember that the circular flow diagram is useful to keep in mind when thinking about how all of these pieces fit together in the economy and how the economy is organized.